Hello everyone, I hope you're all well. My name is Sarah and this is my week 2 update, progress update for World Peace Angel by Lavender and Lace. I have it here in front of me on my scroll frame and you can see there that I've made, hopefully you can see I've made a little bit of progress. I'm just going to put this to one side because it's kind of heavy. So I'll hopefully be able to insert a photo of where we finished week 1 and then a photo of what it looks like now at the end of week 2, and you can see there has been a little bit of progress. Now my goal going into week 2 was to finish her entire sleeve, that kind of purple section, lilac-y section of her sleeve, and then also to do the gold part of the dress, which kind of goes above that purple section, and then also to do the gold bands around her wrists. Now I didn't do those gold bands because a lot of that section around the wrist is actually made up of speciality thread, of metallic thread, and I'm not doing my metallic threads right now, so I didn't really bother with that. And then as you can see, I did manage to get the gold section of her shawl, kind of this bit, dress, shawl, whatever it is. It's kind of hard to tell because there's a lot of fabric on that dress, but that bit is nearly fit, like 99% finished. I just need to finish off this strand of thread here. So that's where my progress got me to this week. It does feel like I'm making really slow progress on this. Again, it's summer. A lot of people I think have other things they'd rather be doing. It's very warm weather. I know a lot of people are saying that their own stitching is going really slowly, so that makes me feel a little bit better. But I am still getting some progress, so I guess that's a good thing. And my goal for week 3 is to do the blue parts. So again, I'll try and insert a bigger photo of what the finished piece should look like. But she does have these blue sections on her dress. So there's one below that purple section, and then there's one running up her arm. So I'd like to get the 2 of them finished. And then there's just a little section kind of at her waist as well, which is those blue colours. Now there is more blue on the dress. There's blue at the bottom, as you can see, but I won't be doing that right now because I'm not at that part yet. So that's my goal for this coming week. Now I am going to be away for the weekend and then Monday as well. So I won't really probably get back to stitching until Tuesday. So it'll be a pretty short stitching week. So actually maybe that's a little bit ambitious. But we'll see what happens. So that's it. I am really enjoying it. One of my favorite things about this piece is something that I've actually never encountered in a Lavender and Lace or a Mirabilia before. And it's the fact that there are so many colors. There's kind of these blocks of color. So we had the purple block, and then we had the goldy coloured block, and now we're moving on to the blue block, and then we'll probably go on to the green section, which is kind of the majority of her dress. Then there's red, and then there's other bits. And that actually makes it a lot of fun to stitch because you kind of have these very defined sections to stitch, and then you're done with those colours and you can move on to other colours. So that part I've actually really enjoyed. And like I said, it's not something I've seen on too many of the pieces. Usually the dresses in these Lavender and Lace and Mirabilias tend to follow one kind of colour scheme. The other one I can think of off the top of my head is Angelica. I think Angelica uses quite a lot of colours, and there's probably more. I'm just trying to think off the top of my head. So that's how my stitching went this week, and hopefully next week I'll be back with a little bit more to show you on that front. So there's something else that I thought I might add on to the end of these stitching updates. This won't be for everyone, but I just thought it could be fun. And that is to update you on what I have been listening to whilst stitching. So whenever I see a stitching update, I always kind of wonder, what is this person doing when they're stitching? And I know a lot of people watch TV, a lot of people listen to podcasts or music. Of course, many of us watch YouTube. And I also really like to listen to audiobooks. And I first got into audiobooks back when I was in university. I was studying English and history, both very text-heavy subjects, very long reading lists, and it was impossible sometimes to get through the reading list for that week for both subjects, and then all the different classes within those subjects. So what I started doing was I started trying to find the novels or some of the history texts that were on the reading list, and then downloading them as audiobooks and trying to get through them that way. And I would listen to them while walking to and from college. And it was great because I actually found that I absorbed the information a lot better by listening to it than I would have had I been reading it with my eyes. And so that's where the love of audiobooks began really for me and kind of continued. I do think some books lend themselves better to audio than others, and I think a lot depends on the narrator. So that is a big consideration for me, and I know for a lot of people. But anyway, on to what I've been listening to this week, and I'm not quite finished, but I'm nearly finished, and it is Winter Solstice by Rosamunde Pilcher. Now, Rosamunde Pilcher is sadly no longer with us. She was a very beloved English author. Originally, I think she came from Cornwall and then ended up spending a lot of her life up in Scotland, I believe, and that's where this book, Winter Solstice, is actually set. Pilcher had a very, very long writing career and quite a prolific writing career. She began, I believe, as a Mills and Boon author, writing romances for Mills and Boon, and I think she wrote some of those under a pen name. I'm going to say it was Jane Foster, but I could have that totally wrong. I don't know. That could be just me confusing the name for someone else. But she wrote these Mills and Boons. Then she went on to write her own under her own name and wrote many, many novels and short story collections. And then in, I think it was 87, she wrote a book called Shell Seekers. Shell Seekers was enormously well received. It really kind of skyrocketed her career up to another level. It was just an enormous success and often finds itself on lists of, you know, the best British books of all time, 100 books you must read before you die, all these kind of things. And it is a beautiful book. Shell Seekers was then followed by September, which I haven't read. September was followed by Coming Home, which I have here. It's enormous. And then Coming Home was followed by Winter Solstice. And those four books are often known as the big four of Pilcher's works because they're four quite long books, and they are certainly the four that, from what I gather, had the greatest success. So this is Coming Home. This is probably, like I said, one of my favorite books of all time. It is absolutely extraordinary. It's huge. I mean, you can see there's a lot of reading here. I don't know how many pages is in this book. 785. This book follows a young girl called Judith Dunbar, who the book begins in 1936. Her father is working in Ceylon, which I think is Sri Lanka, and her mum and her younger sister have come back to England in 1936 to settle her into boarding school. She's going to boarding school in Cornwall, and then her mum and sister go back to join the dad, and she remains in Cornwall at this boarding school where she befriends a young girl called Lavender, who comes from a very wealthy family who have this great big estate called Nanchero in Cornwall. And it basically kind of follows Judith and these other characters who she meets along the way through the 30s and then, of course, into the 40s and the start of the Second World War, when Judith is kind of coming of age. And it's beautiful. This novel is really, really beautiful. I would really recommend it. I have read this, but I listened to this as well on audiobook, and it was just glorious and beautiful. And like I said, one of my favourite books of all time. And I'm quite fussy with books, so that's a great one. This one, though, is, like I said, called Winter Solstice. Now, it might seem a bit strange to be reading a book called Winter Solstice in summer during a heat wave. And I do kind of wish I'd held off and read it around the winter solstice in the cooler months, but I didn't, and I still have really enjoyed it. And actually, it's kind of made me look forward to the cooler months, because obviously every season is beautiful and every season has its positives, but I'm not actually the greatest fan of summer. I quite enjoy the autumn and the winter, and I think a lot of people feel that way. So Winter Solstice was the last of the big four, and also the last of Rosamunde Pilcher's books to be published, from what I can gather. It was published in the year 2000. And the audiobook, sorry, I have written notes here because I forget everything. The audiobook is 17 hours, 52 minutes, so just shy of 18 hours, which I think is quite a nice length for an audiobook, actually. And the narrator was Gilly Bond, who did an amazing job. She, not all narrators, in my opinion, are suitable for the job of narrating an audiobook. This lady did a wonderful, wonderful job. She has such warmth in her voice. And she does the accents really well, and she gives each character a very unique voice and a very unique accent, and so they're kind of instantly recognizable as you're listening to the book. And yeah, it's just brilliant. So I have 4 hours and 5 minutes left to go, and it's one of those ones that I kind of want to know how it ends, but I also don't want it to end, and I felt very much that way with Coming Home, which was much longer. By the time I got to the end of it, I didn't really want it to end. So what is Winter Solstice about? Well, Winter Solstice follows 5 characters as they spend the winter solstice in a house in Scotland, near to Inverness, so quite high up in Scotland. And these 5 characters kind of come together by a strange set of coincidences and strange set of circumstances. They don't all know each other, and they all have one thing in common, which is that they have all kind of suffered a certain amount of trauma, I guess, in recent months. So they're all kind of coming together into this house in Scotland, all carrying a certain amount of, like I said, trauma or damage, and all not feeling sorry for themselves, but maybe licking their wounds to a certain degree. And the characters are Elfrida and Oscar, who are both in their 60s, and they have known each other before they end up in Scotland, but they haven't known each other for that long. Then there's Carrie, who is in her late 20s, early 30s, I think, and she has just come back from working in a ski resort in Austria, and she's had a bit of a tough time. Then there's Carrie's niece, Lucy, who is 14. And Lucy comes from a bit of a dysfunctional family, so she's quite happy to get away from that. And then Carrie and Elfrida, they're related. I think Carrie's dad is Elfrida's first cousin, so they kind of know each other. So that's how they end up in the house. And then there's another chap called Sam, who has just come back from working in New York, where he went through a little bit of turmoil of his own, and he has come to Scotland to try and bring back to life a woolen mill, like a tweed manufacturing factory mill sort of thing, that has gone to seed, basically, just become abandoned, and he's sent back to bring this mill back to life and create some employment in this rural community. And then he ends up spending some time with them too. And like a lot of Pilcher's work, I think it's not the most plot-driven novel ever. If you're really into thrillers or, high-stake novels with a really fast-moving plot, like a detective novel or a thriller, you're probably not going to get that with Pilcher's work. What she writes or wrote instead, because she's no longer with us, but what she wrote were very much character-driven novels, and she wrote them beautifully. I think it's quite hard to write a very, very character-driven novel with not much in the way of plot. I think it takes a very, very skilled author to do that, and Pilcher was, an absolute expert at what she was doing, and her novels are very, very beautiful. And this one is no exception. It's so atmospheric, it's so cozy. They're up in this beautiful house in Scotland with all the village people kind of milling around them, and they're settling themselves into the community, and they're getting ready for Christmas, because of course it kind of is centered around the winter solstice, so the 21st of December. And yeah, it's lovely, and I don't want it to end, but it will end, and then I'll probably move on to something else, and then I might go back and listen to something else from Pilcher, because she's one of those authors, I think, that once you've read some of her work, you know, to go to another novel straight away is a little bit jarring because the tone is so different. Her tone is so warm. So that's what I've been listening to. Hopefully we'll finish that this week or early next week. We'll see. And then move on to something else when I get on to some more stitching, and when I hopefully move on to stitching the blue section of our World Peace Angel. So that's all for this week. Thank you for watching. If you've made it this far, I know I babble on quite a lot, so if you've managed to watch to the end, thank you. If you are stitching something and you want to let us know, brilliant. If you're reading a book or listening to an audiobook, I'd love to know. I'm always looking for recommendations. The only genre I'm not a great fan of is horror and fantasy. Now, it's kind of weird because Lord of the Rings is probably my favourite book series of all times, but I've always interpreted the Lord of the Rings as not being a fantasy novel, but as being a war novel or a trilogy of war novels, depending on what way you look at it, which is strange because they're kind of the quintessential fantasy novels, aren't they? But for me, they just never read like a fantasy novel, and I'm not always a great fan of other types of fantasy novels. But yes, so that's all for this week. Thank you for watching. Take care of yourselves, and I will see you next week with hopefully some more stitching to show. Bye.